All right, picture this. It's like a chess match, but instead of your classic board, it's the open ocean we're talking about.
Yeah, high-stakes chess.
And instead of pawns, you've got these insane foiling sailboats that are practically flying across the water.
Basically flying, yeah.
That's the America's Cup, and today we're diving deep into the pre-start battles, specifically the Louis Vuitton Cup finals, Italy versus Great Britain.
Those moments right before the starting gun, they're not just about, jockeying for a little bit of space.
It's almost like psychological warfare, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. It's about exploiting those little wind shifts and really using the technology of these boats to your advantage.
And we are talking about cutting-edge stuff here. These aren't your grandfather's sailboats.
Not even close. We're talking about hydrofoils, which are basically like underwater wings. They lift the entire hull out of the water.
Wow.
So there's way less drag, which means crazy speeds.
Speed is obviously huge, but we've got a ton of data analysis here from the Louis Vuitton Cup, and it seems like even with all this high-tech wizardry, some things never change, right?
It's true. It's actually kind of fascinating, even with how fast and maneuverable these boats are. We're still seeing teams using those classic match racing tactics.
Oh, really? Like what?
Things like controlling the dirty air behind their boats and forcing their opponent into, well, unfavorable positions. The playbook might be old, but the way they're using it is totally new school.
We've even got a wind conditions table here that shows just how much the wind varied from race to race, everything from a light breeze to some serious gusts.
Right, and that's huge because those wind shifts add a whole other level of complexity. A maneuver that's brilliant in one race could be a disaster in another. They had to be really adaptable on the fly.
So we're talking traditional tactics, cutting-edge technology, and unpredictable conditions.
That's right.
Sounds like a recipe for some excitement.
Absolutely.
All right, so we've got this high-speed chess match going on with the wind adding a whole other level of, well, wild card, right?
Yeah, totally.
Let's get into some of these pre-start maneuvers because I think this is where it gets really interesting.
It really is. The pre-start is all about positioning, momentum, and, a little bit of psychological warfare. Each move is a calculated risk.
Totally a gamble.
Trying to get that edge before the starting gun even goes off.
Exactly. And one of the moves that really jumped out at us from the data was this port boat circle.
Right.
Now, I know that sounds a little jargony, but imagine like one boat sailing in a tight circle, almost like chasing its tail, trying to force the other boat into a less favorable position.
Exactly. It's a way to control the space. You dictate the terms of engagement. And what's really interesting here is the British team used this in almost half their races.
Wow.
The Italians never did once.
Really? So the Brits found something that worked and they stuck with it.
Yeah, maybe they had a secret weapon. Maybe they found a weakness in the Italian team's pre-start and they just went for it.
Interesting. So real strategic thinking there.
Yeah.
Then there's these two other maneuvers, the jibe to lead and the jibe to push.
Okay.
Now, for those of us who don't speak fluent sailing, can you break those down a little?
Yeah, so picture yourself sailing along, and you need to change direction. You swing the back of the boat, the stern, through the wind. That's a jibe.
Okay.
And a jibe to lead is all about getting a burst of speed as you come out of that turn so you can hopefully get ahead of your opponent.
So it's kind of like a, power move.
Yeah, exactly, a power move. Then you've got the jibe to push, which is a little more aggressive.
Yeah?
You're not just trying to get ahead. You're trying to put your opponent in a bad spot, maybe force them too close to the starting line.
Controlling your opponent rather than just focusing on your own position.
Exactly.
And the data here shows some interesting stuff. The British team, all about that jibe to lead.
Interesting.
While the Italians used kind of a mix of different things, they did a rollover to lead, a shift right, kind of mixing it up.
And don't forget that wind table we talked about earlier. Those conditions probably played a big part in what they chose.
Yeah, totally.
Like a jibe to lead might be great when it's windy and you need that extra speed.
Right.
But in lighter winds, something like a rollover might be way more effective. What can this tell us about their overall strategies?
Well, it highlights the different approaches, right? Some teams, like Luna Rossa, prioritize positioning, leveraging wind shifts. Others, like Ineos, might opt for a more aggressive approach, trying to, dictate the terms of engagement early on.
It's fascinating how those pre-start maneuvers, you can offer this glimpse into each team's personality.
It's true.
But even with a brilliant tactical plan.
So we've got these tactical moves, the wind shifting, but then it all comes down to that, that moment of truth.
Oh, yeah.
Crossing that starting line.
It's everything.
Fractions of a second making all the difference.
Absolutely. Even being a tiny bit late can just throw everything off,
Totally.
the data here gets really, really detailed, looking at speeds and angles, the distance between the boats.
Yeah, what's jumping out at you from those starting line stats?
Timing is everything, isn't it?
Yeah.
It really is. You can have, like, the most cunning plan, the most amazing boat, but if you mistime that final dash to the line, it's all for nothing.
It's over.
Speaking of timing, that's another place where the data gets really interesting.
Oh, yeah. We're talking fractions of a second here,
Right.
the late seconds data. That tells us how many seconds after the starting signal each boat actually crossed the line. And the goal is to be perfectly positioned at full speed right as that gun goes off.
Because even a tiny delay, I mean,
Oh, it's huge.
you're playing catch-up for the rest of the race.
Exactly. A bad start can put you on the back foot strategically, and it might force you to take more risks later on.
So you're not just racing the clock, you're racing the other team and, like, the consequences of a less than ideal start.
Absolutely. And speaking of racing, we can't forget about speed. The data on speed at start knots and speed advantage knots, that gives us a clear picture of how fast those boats were moving at that critical moment.
It's like drag racing, but on water.
Yes.
A higher speed at the start
Huge advantage.
can translate into such a lead.
Oh, absolutely. A speed advantage allows you to dictate terms, control the space, and potentially force your opponent into making mistakes.
So all of this makes me wonder, how much does a successful pre-start actually influence the outcome of the whole race?
Right.
Is there a correlation
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it?
between, winning those pre-start battles and ultimately taking home the trophy? It sounds like it's not just about that initial burst off the line, though.
No.
There's more to it than just who's ahead after the starting gun fires.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, you're right.
So we've got to talk about these crosses.
Okay.
That's a term I need some more explanation on.
Right.
It's not as simple as it sounds, is it?
You're catching on. So remember, these boats are racing on a windward-leeward course,
Okay.
meaning they're zigzagging up the course,
Right.
not just sailing in a straight line.
Okay.
Each time those boats cross paths as they're sailing these opposite directions towards that first mark, that's a cross.
Got it.
Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So why are those first two crosses so important? What happens in those early moments that can make or break a race?
It's all about that windward mark.
Okay.
That critical turning point on the course where the boats switch from sailing against the wind to sailing with it.
Right.
Whoever rounds that mark first has a massive advantage.
Huge.
Cleaner wind, they've got control of the race course, the ability to really dictate the strategy going forward.
So it's like a tactical bottleneck.
Yeah.
Everyone's fighting for that prime position.
100%. And those first two crosses often determine who's in the driver's seat, so to speak, as they approach that mark.
Oh, interesting.
A skilled team will use those crosses to maneuver their opponent into a really bad spot,
Okay.
maybe even forcing them to sail a less efficient angle or giving up the right of way.
It's like they're playing chess,
Right.
using those crosses to set up their opponent for checkmate later in the race.
That's a great way to put it. And the data really does highlight how those early maneuvers, especially those first two crosses, have this really strong connection to who ultimately rounds the windward mark first, which, as we've discussed, is often the difference maker in an America's Cup race.
This is why we do these deep dives.
Right.
We've been talking about those first two crosses, how important that windward mark is.
It's crucial.
But you mentioned some interesting findings about how wind strength played into all of this.
Yeah.
What did the data tell us?
So Italy, they favored that right-hand start,
Right.
those more aggressive maneuvers.
Right.
But they really struggled when the wind died down.
Really?
Yeah, particularly in races 3, 9, 10, and 11.
So their go big or go home strategy worked in those like windier conditions,
It seemed to.
but maybe backfired a little
Maybe.
when things were a bit lighter.
Yeah, and that's where the adaptable skill set really comes in. Now, the data doesn't get into specific maneuvers,
Right.
but it does make you wonder what adjustments could they have made in those lighter winds.
So it's almost like they had the playbook down for those windier races,
Right.
but hadn't quite figured out what to do when the wind died down a bit.
And it's easy to analyze in hindsight, of course.
Sure.
But that's what's so cool about this sport.
Yeah,
It's this constant chess match on the water.
it is.
Requiring, raw talent, strategic ingenuity.
And every race, every wind shift
First
presents a whole
place.
new set of challenges.
Exactly.
And that's what makes all this analysis so fascinating.
100%.
We see these broader patterns,
Yeah.
these tendencies,
Yeah.
but then we're also left with these questions about those little micro adjustments,
Right.
the things that could have, made the difference. in those closer races.
Because it really is those tiny margins,
It is.
those like split-second decisions made in the heat of the moment
Right.
that often separate the champions from, everyone else.
The contenders.
Exactly. It's not just about who crosses the finish line first, but how they got there.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like we've unlocked this secret code
I like that.
that lets us see the race within the race.
I like that a lot, yeah. And honestly, we've only scratched the surface.
Yeah, this is true.
I encourage everyone listening, go check out some videos of these America's Cup pre-starts.
Big thanks to our expert for guiding us through this incredible analysis. Until next time, everyone, keep exploring, keep learning, and as always, happy diving.